Thank you, Mark, for the invitation. When Mark initially approached me, he wanted me to unpack a little bit my experience of being an artist in residence at the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm. So I'll walk through a little bit the process, how it was for me to be a visual artist, being pretty much casted or thrown into the world of Museum of Ethnography. You're all experts in the matter, and I'm not, so I'm the non-expert speaking now. But one thing that I can say before we start, in less than 24 hours being here, I've noticed that a lot of highly educated people here tend to say, we use artists in our museum. I think that use of language perhaps is something to be discussed in one of our conversation or Q&A later. So before starting, I just wanted to say I'm a visual artist, not medium specific. I'm from Montreal, from unceded indigenous land of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, or the Mohawk people as we know it, so the French-speaking part of Canada. I grew up in Côte-des-Neiges, which is the most densely populated of ethnically diverse neighborhoods in Canada. So neither French nor English are the dominant languages. And so I did my BFA in Montreal and later went to Sweden to do my MFA at Malmö Art Academy. So my relationship with Sweden was already established through my studies from 2013 before doing the Switch residency program in 2015 in Stockholm. So when I saw the open call, I applied with submitted a proposal where actually I was interested in the photographic archives of the museum. Basically because of my own family history of migration from Vietnam before the end of the Vietnam War to Montreal, and the photographic collection that my granddad brought with him to Montreal. So it's a collection of about 100 photographs that we have, which basically chronicles my great-grandfather's life, Nguyen. And he was a Mandarin, a high-ranking Mandarin civil servant for the last emperor and empress of Indochina in Hue. And basically, my proposal was to look at what happens when people of color, people with a history of migration, basically use their own family history, particularly based on photographs, and put it in contrast with documents that has been collected and are in the holdings of institutions. What kind of tension and frictions that are created between family documents and institutional documents. And so prior to the residency itself, I looked at the database that the Museum of Ethnography had to offer and found this one photograph on the left, which basically, I think it said something, a lot of question mark, like our previous speaker pointed out with the broom, question mark, this person sitting with a royal gown with a bird. That was pretty much the description of who she was. So with further studies, I found out that the photo was taken in 1934 in Hue. It's the last empress of Indochina, Nam Phuong, and it's her wedding day, basically. The picture on the right is a picture of Nam Phuong. 10 years later, in 1944, she's holding her daughter, most likely her daughter, fourth child, and pregnant of her fifth child. And this photo is signed and dated and given to my great-grandfather as a sign of thanking him for the quality of his work. And so I've been lucky enough that these images survived the two wars, the Indo-Chinese War and the Vietnamese War, and that after the fall of Saigon in 1975, the communists invaded the South. Many people burned their clothes that could actually signal or have any affiliations with the southern Vietnamese government, or images that could either have a relationship with the royal court or foreign military presence, particularly American forces or South Vietnamese governance. So this was my proposal. I entered the museum, or I was lucky enough that Michael Barrett and his selection committee decided to select my proposal amongst others who applied and invited me to further push this project and to think more about this tension and those frictions that could arise between these two types of holdings and what kind of knowledge is being produced then or what are the knowledges that can be put in dialogue. I quickly realized that actually it was a frustrating process due to different reasons. The lack of information with a lot of material that have been recorded. The Museum of Ethnography has about 500,000 images in their holdings, and a fraction of it, maybe 40%, has been digitized. And that's something that I hope we can talk a little bit, the digitizing process, or the kind of transferring of knowledge from physical artifacts to a digital database. And so my main concern was actually to put our family history in a context or an institution that basically functions with a lens, an ethnographic lens, colonial lens, and to try to kind of unpack this material that would be very difficult to have a different reading outside of how we understand a museum of ethnography to function. So because of some of these limitations and frustrations with Michael, we decided to do a workshop titled You Are Here Because They Were There, which is a paraphrasing Stuart Hall's quote, where he talks about the umbilical connection that exists between empires and colonies, that because of the presence of certain bodies here at the center of Europe is because of previous, I mean, you all know, previous presence of extraction in the colonies, basically. And so the workshop invited a number of participants to come and bring their own family photos, and trying to, again, reproduce this method of working, trying to look at family histories of people who has a history of migration, and look at the holdings of the museums, and what happens then when we start to talk about this discrepancy that exists between the narratives that exist within the homes and the families, and the traumas that come with it as well, and the difficulty even to articulate what has happened in between the photographs and the current life conditions that we're living in, partly due to the trauma, and that families are looking forward often and don't necessarily want to look back at the past, and that even certain stories that aren't even told, whereas the museum construct these narratives in a very different way in terms of understanding similar places or similar people. So here we have Azran Hidari. She is of Kurdish descent. I won't go too much in deep for each of the participants, but one thing that I do want to mention that was very instrumental in the making of these workshops was to create it as a safe space. So it was a close groups of participants, all of people of color, where actually we felt that we were comfortable to talk about these stories without having an external judgment or a sense of the expert gaze that was looking into our histories and our stories, so that we could actually talk about the difficulties that we're experiencing just in the shaping of talking about what these images are showing us. So here we have Asmara Niguse, who is of Eritrean descent. So she talks here about her relatives on this picture, and then picked up this image from the museum's holdings, a photograph taken in the early 1900s of Tukul. Her mother is from there. And so the day before the workshop, she called her mom and started to show the photograph and talked about this place. And her mom remembered clearly this little hill and this area, and talked about how at the forefront of this image, which we don't see yet because in the 1930s and 40s, that's where the Italians built a runway in hopes of expanding their colonial expansion into Ethiopia. So in the workshop, which has been really rich, and also, and I think one of our fellow artists here talking about the pain that we have to experience, and I think the difficulties, and I think that was definitely present in the workshop of trying to reconcile with the gaps that are created in our lives. But what was also very interesting, and I really took out of this workshop, was the intergenerational conversations that happen with, for example, with Asmara and her mom, and also different relatives in the family, and hoping that there's a way of understanding these methods that could be further developed or kind of thought in the museum. However, I'm not necessarily sure the need for an outcome or a form of visibility right away. I think just the fact of creating these spaces of conversations are instrumental in terms of creating trust and just opening up a space for certain communities or individuals to be able to talk about their history. So while being at the museum, I realized that I was facing some limitations with my initial proposal, and I think what has been instrumental is the fact that I was able to walk around and physically access the archive of photographs, and actually to reflect how these images as material culture as well have traveled also and had their own history of displacement. And so thinking about how things are moving from one place to another, and particularly how photographs were able to actually capture some of those displacement. At the end of my residency, I submitted an exhibition proposal to Michael and the rest of the museum for an exhibition which looks more closely at actually trying to, through some images that I found in the archives, basically to think about how museums in the West have filled their storage and how this material culture has arrived here. And basically, it's looking at the modes of transportation, the logistics behind moving these artifacts to the West, particularly crates, and more importantly, who were the people who actually enabled this transportation of material culture from one place of the world to filling the museums in the West, basically. So while at the museum and being able to walk around and find these moments of ruptures with images that showed me this labor power at work, an example like this one, where you could see hordes of people that are working to move stuff from one place to another. At the same time, the museum has a permanent exhibition that it's titled "The World in My Backpack," which somehow, for me, was this kind of contrasting narrative of this idea of like traveling light and the world is just easily accessible, and you have the explorer that just has his North Face bag and just like filling up with stuff, and all of a sudden it appears in our museums here in the West. And so it's challenging, at least at the Museum of Ethnography, challenging this narrative of actually it's not such an easy endeavor in terms of transporting stuff from one place to another. And so the exhibition is titled Black Atlas. So Atlas, I'm referring to the mythological figure Atlas that has the burden to carry the world on his shoulders as a punishment, and black in a kind of post-colonial or a colonial English British understanding of black as being non-white people, basically. And so Black Atlas is composed of 5 elements, which kind of looks at different parts of, or different understandings of the museum's collection and the logistics of moving things around. Here we have a piece that is titled A Portable Darkroom, Bearing Witness, which basically is inspired by my initial encounter with the whole kind of exhibition premise is the image on the upper left corner, which is Erik von Otter, who's in the jungle with a portable darkroom, and processing images in the jungle. There's other images where we see that he has helpers that are carrying this darkroom for him. And so this idea of looking at the camera as a magic tool of the white man, often used in foreign places as a way of controlling populations, as being, well, I can make this magic by creating images. And so often it was, or has been used as a way of actually forcing or engaging certain population to do certain things for the visiting explorer. So that was my initial encounter with this idea of transportation and carrying, and then underneath you have Erik von Rosen, that he himself is being carried by indigenous local people. So this idea that the intellectual is being carried and not only the artifacts. So this is the first piece, and then the second piece here is titled The Burden of Knowledge, which in the process of doing research, we went to the storage place, which is located in the suburb of Stockholm, where there's crates that are there that are still unopened and somehow unclear. I don't know if this should be sent live, but unclear what is the content of those crates. So this idea, again here, the burden of knowledge, this kind of excessive accumulation of stuff without necessarily knowing what is to be revealed yet, but still has a physicality that needs to be moved from one place to another. At the forefront here on the left, you have number 17, which is the cover of one of the crates by Montel, which was a friend of Sven Hedin. So they did extensive trips and brought back so much, which basically it's the core of a lot of what exists in the storage of the Museum of Ethnography, Sven Hedin and his friends doing their expeditions and bringing back. So this is the cover of a crate, and I thought it was interesting to think about the ethnographic kind of thinking of why is this cover existing in the storage of the museum, but then it's not classified as an ethnographic element, but it's still there as decoration. So how do we divide then what are objects of ethnographic value, but then what has been the structure itself to make this field of study needed is somehow not being included. And then you have this series of photographs titled The Administration, which the two top images are the storage place of Wallingatan, the initial Museum of Ethnography. And a lot of the photographs are actually focusing on the museum when it was located at Wallingatan, partly because the museum, its first initial donation was in 1739, and it was a donation to the Royal Academy of Science, and was later displayed at the National Natural History Museum, but it's only in the early 1900s when the Museum of Ethnography got its own building and the emergence of the Museum of Ethnography as an institution. So that was the turning point for me. That was interesting to think of what makes an institution and what makes a museum, and how do they organize their knowledge. So most of the material is from the early 1900s that coincides with the emergence of this type of institution or museum display, and thinking about knowledge in a classified particular way. So top two images are the storage place on Wallingatan, and the three bottom are staff of the museum, and the center one is the director at the time. So the kind of foundational to upholding this system of knowledge titled The Administration. And here is the poster boy, Black Atlas, which is a porter that was photographed by Guillaume Byrne in Istanbul. And basically, he got donated a photo studio from Germany that he moved to Istanbul and made his studio there. And so he was receiving a lot of the dignitaries and official people coming from Stockholm and the West in general, and doing portraits of them, but doing many images of the city. And he also had almost like an indexical series of photographs looking at different professions existing in Istanbul at the time. One of them being the porter, and it's placed on a plinth that was initially used as a display element for artifacts in a previous exhibition that I've just acquired and reorganize it into this piece, basically. So that was the exhibition, and I think one thing that I wanted to kind of think about as well, the importance of having me as an artist, or the importance, I wouldn't claim that myself, but what was instrumental for me in order to be able to do this work was me being at the museum, and just the fact of having me as an artist, person of color in the institution and the archives. I think that was already a site of contention and a bit of resistance from some of the staff members, wondering what kind of knowledge am I going to be creating or generating there, and questioning why the institution needed an artist to do this kind of work. Probably cheap labor, because I'm a cheaper consultant than a professional that would come in. But also the uncertainties of what kind of knowledge that would be created. And I think that was also a site of a nervousness in terms of what is she going to be unraveling. But more importantly, the limitation of the digital database, because what I was interested in and the type of images I was looking at, none of the language that I needed actually existed in the database in terms of thinking about crates and database, crates and logistics, transportation. Those weren't really the keywords that were existing. So in a way, the type of knowledge that exists in the database is representative of the time that the images were taken or later on translated into the digital format. But then in order to access the question of accessibility, I think it was would not have been possible in the same way if I only worked from distance at home, elsewhere, and just through the digital database. But really the fact that I could be there on site and manually flip through images made this project possible. So I see, in a way, Black Atlas kind of a reflexive, kind of turning the ethnographic gaze back to the institution. And I think that is, I mean, we're talking a lot about source communities and what they have to offer and how we can engage in these fruitful and generative conversations with, I think are fundamental. But I think it's also important as institutions to be also self-critical of how this discipline came into being. And I think that's what I tried to do, to turn the gaze back to the institution here. And yeah, I think part of the inspiration also was coming from a quote from Les Statues meurent aussi, a film that was realized by Alain René and Chris Marker in 1953. He opens this film by saying, "When men die, they enter into history. When statues die, they enter into art. This botany of death is what we call culture." The film was censored because of its anti-colonial, anti-French colonial project. But this idea of the botany of death, I think, was very fruitful for me to kind of approach and think about this project as the funeral procession, basically, that we're looking at, of extracting artifacts and culture from elsewhere. So now there's a publication that is in the making, and is thanks to the Sharjah Art Foundation project program that is supporting the publication, with essays by Ariel Azoulay, conversation between myself and curator Ulrika Flink, Vincent Normand, Gabriel Moser, and Åsa Barati-Larsson. So hopefully that it will give a bit more of, not so much a catalog of the exhibition, but more a book that looks essays that are looking at similar questions, but approached from different angles. So this is hopefully will be done by the end of this year. Yeah, so that's the outcome that I'm hoping in the short term, and the type of conversations that we'll be able to pursue beyond the exhibition itself and the artwork, but also through the publication. Yeah, that's basically what I've done.
Well, thank you so much, Jacqueline. I think what you've been talking about there is really picked up on quite a lot of issues that we've explored this morning, but also no doubt we will be exploring in the following session, thinking about just in your last point about the difference between digital access and that sort of, and the access one has when physically walking around the museum and internally and going, you know, underneath the different layers. And I think we can probably think in some ways about in terms of the kind of privileged access that we're thinking about and that we work with. So hopefully don't want to steer the next group too much, but hopefully that we'll be able to have an opportunity to interrogate that possibly with you as the discussion goes on. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
shut that down. Yeah, and then mine's that.
Just a minute as we just sort make sure we've got all the PowerPoints lined up. Are we okay?
Should be fine.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, welcome very much everyone to this afternoon's panel discussion. Collections are typically thought of as being absolutely core to the museum's identity and to what it does. And traditionally, collections care has involved trying to maintain the physical integrity of the object through restricted handling, storage conditions, environmental controls, and conservation. But what if we think about objects as having different kinds of needs, not just physical needs? There's an exhibition that is currently on at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa called Guiding the Gallery, Elders, Community Members, and Indigenous Experts. Every evening at the National Gallery of Canada, after the exhibition closes to the public, the staff place a red blanket over the display case protecting Quellenquakla, a seated stone figure from the Qualton First Nation in the Fraser River Valley of British Columbia. He's treated as one might treat a respected relative. The blanket helps him feel secure and keeps him warm while he is visiting the gallery. I think this example raises some of the questions that are going to be addressed by our panel members in this session this afternoon. What does it mean to care for collections today? And we have our speakers are coming from a variety of sort of professional and institutional backgrounds. So I'd first like to welcome Dean Sully, who is both a practicing conservator and a lecturer, senior lecturer in conservation at UCL in London.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to speak to you all. I put Henna Mihi up as my first slide. Henna Mihi isn't a museum object, but this is something fundamentally that's affected my attitude to conservation and the care of collections in museums. So Henna Mihi has been instrumental for me in that process. So for me not to talk about Henna Mihi, it wouldn't be possible for me to speak about these things. But I'm going to frame the idea of conservation within a broader heritage context, of which museums are an institutional part of that framing. So I wanted to sort of go through a personal and academic journey. A lot of the language that I'm using, I think, is familiar because it's the language that we've been using over the past couple of days. But my task is not really the task of an anthropologist or the task of a curator. It's a specific disciplinary requirement to apply these ideas to taking action with heritage objects and places. So that's my task. How do we apply these ideas to making decisions about and then taking action with heritage objects and places? As academics, we like to make a claim for these shifts of paradigm, these transformational changes in understanding. I think I'm going to make a small claim, really, for a transition within the authorized heritage discourse. So it's pointing your elbows at the outside of the authorized heritage discourse, if you like, trying to stretch what is possible and what is proper within that process. So rather than the transformation of Henna Mihi in this process, also that's a transitional process. It's a transition between ideas of the past and the present, and also between this idea of an active space in the current formation of the world, or a more stable place, which is something that is seen in retrospect. So this has been my task, theorizing conservation within colonial and post-colonial processes. And the tools that I've been using are decolonization and transcultural practice and participatory mechanisms. And this is a way to sort of challenge some of the established theories and practice in my particular discipline. And for me, this has been a shift from maintaining material authenticity to a focus on the performance of contemporary cultural practice. And Linda Tuhawaii-Smith has been mentioned. That's my primary source of gaining access to a Maori world. And I've shamelessly plagiarized. I didn't realize what the publisher had done for my book, which is taking that idea of decolonizing as a methodology. But really, my primary source for this has been the Maori community, the source community Ngāti Henna Mihi in New Zealand, and primarily Jim Schuster, the spokesperson for Teni Waitera's work, and the Maori diaspora in London, Ngāti Ranana, of which George is a member. And this decolonizing process is applied to other places. My source of inspiration is Tutanekai, when I first encountered Maori-built heritage with Jim Schuster back in the early noughties, but also gaining inspiration from other projects, I suppose from my point of view, quite exotic projects in the Tibetan plateau of the Tibet Heritage Fund, but then reflecting on what that means to my own practice here in Britain. So maybe the most intimate and local examples, which is a local village church here, which is a 12th century Norfolk rural church in my neighborhood of Norfolk, and this urban centre, House Mill, which is an 18th century charitable trust heritage property. So looking at objects then, I've got a fuzzy image of George up there. I was able to warn him. These are some of the object projects that we've been looking at, how this idea of Maori kaupapa, how this different worldview, or these different worlds, can have effect on the way that we look after and care for Maori Tonga in Britain. And this example of a Tomoko gourd was a student project for one of my conservation students, in which he was looking after the physical stability of the object. Mark Nesbitt, who's organising the Kera collections for the economic botany collections, has specific ideas about how his collection functions as research specimens, but also as visitor objects. And then George, and this wonderful thing here, I've not got a very good photograph, George, is a Perspex spirit box that George carved in order to create a safe storage environment for that object, to protect people within the store, but also to sort of protect the spirituality of the object itself. But this was the packaging that was required in the collections. This is archival materials, blue board, acid-free tissue, fairly common sense. So this is part of the kind of the tension really between the normal practices of the museum, the authorized practices of heritage professionals, and some of the other ideas that we might wish to bring into our Kera collections practice. And I'm just going to, these are some other Maori projects. And I just wanted to sort of linger a little bit on the puhaki, which some of you may have seen yesterday in the museum galleries. And we were involved as much younger people. Look at you there, Anita. Oh, you haven't changed a bit. I have, though. I haven't got all that hair anymore. This is the transition of a large carving from the 1920s in Rotorua, transported over to Britain and being at Whale Island, a British naval base in Portsmouth for almost 90 years. And then the negotiation of that process by Nick to bring the object to Cambridge on long-term loan. And we'll come back to this idea of long-term loan. I think it's an important one. And the process being, there's a logistical process there, physically handling the object, as we saw in Jacqueline's talk. How do those things get transported? How does the museum accept those things physically in? The idea of quarantine, the idea of pest control, then the idea of preparation really for the object to go on display. So if we understand how objects get transformed to becoming museum objects, maybe we can understand how they transition out the other way as well. They become living objects in other contexts. Now the actual decisions I was expecting would be structured around some kind of intellectual model. Actually, they came out of individual discussion. So it's the individuals involved in this process that comes up with the specific action that's required. Jim Schuster being a very important part. Jim said to me that if this was in New Zealand, he would paint this pillar box red. I don't think Nick was particularly keen on that as an idea for his ethnographic object in the museum. So we engaged in that process in which Jim, who was a Maori arts expert and a Maori-built heritage advisor, conducted the interventive work, the carving, putting new power shells on. That decoration had never existed in the object, but Jim said his grandfather, His great-grandfather, didn't have time to finish it, so it was his opportunity to do that for him. And then we did analysis of the coating, because we wanted to put a coating on, not pillar box red paint. So we analysed this as shellac. In the end, we ended up using linseed oil. Now, there's no kind of rationale to using linseed oil in that sense. Jim quite likes it because it saturates the colour a little bit. That was kind of acceptable from a curatorial perspective. It fits into the... But there wasn't any kind of material, science-based decision-making process which you can follow through in a logical sequence about that. It was kind of more serendipitous. So when we think about, well, what can we learn from these particularities, these specific case studies? And in the absence of clear theory, that's maybe all we've got. Well, we can sort of talk about these things in terms of broader concepts like authorized heritage discourse, and out of which comes an authorized heritage practice. As curators in museums, that's what we do. That's what I train my students to do. They spend a long time training. We're making proper museum professionals out of them. And as a result of that, we have our authorized conservation practice. And this is what I think it does. It's a process of purification, which essentializes objects and separates them. Now, this is a tactic that we use in museums to gain control over things. So if we understand that's what we do on the way in, maybe we have some way of dealing with that on the way out. And I suppose what I would like to advocate for is a critical conservation practice in line with critical heritage studies approaches, where we can look at the need to address broader social questions about how the world comes into being, beyond the merely tautological justifications of fixing the past within the heritage places and objects of the present. So this idea of fixing something which is completed as an object rather than something which is evolving and coming into being. And this is the framework that I use to kind of understand that, based around a focus on materials, values, or peoples. And maybe the most important thing to think about is what that means in terms of our responsibility to the object itself. Does the welfare of the material heritage take precedent over contemporary communities? Or, as I would suggest, under a peoples-based framework, then it's the welfare of contemporary communities that take precedent over the welfare of the heritage. Oh yeah, just one more thing is, what does that mean in terms of the object that we produce? Conservation produces one singular object from all these multiple objects that it has the potential for. We used to think that we were looking for truth. Within an idea of consulting about something, the object becomes something that you expect it to be. So you form it into your ideas of what it should be. Increasingly, I'm thinking that all we're able to do is to do something which is plausible. And maybe that's the justification that we use for our process, something which is plausible in the context in which we're making those decisions. And something towards a definition. For conservation is a careful management of change. This is a fairly standard definition. But I'm trying to appropriate the curating term. All you curators, you've had it too easy. The idea of assembling things which have an affordance into the future. So you're bringing those things together so that they are available in the making of the world around us. And really, as another tautological description, conservation is what conservators do, or what we claim to do, I suppose. And this is our aim. We need to create something that is plausible. So this single heritage project, this object that goes on display in the museum, distilled from all the multi-potentiality of the world in formation, so the confusing chaos, the cacophony of the present. So just to think of, what I think I'm very much inside the heritage world. I'm inside this bubble. And I justify that by a series of tautologies. Probably the most damning comment being that conservation is an answer to its own question. So we create a problem, and then mercifully we're the only ones who can provide you with an answer, so then you must come to us. So it's self-fulfilling and self-generating in that process. And that doesn't undermine what I do, I don't think. It liberates what I do. And I think as a response to, this is Cornelius Holtoff's suggestion, that heritage is valued not because it's valuable, but because we protect it. So it's turning those ideas around about the value of heritage. And that leads to the illogical conclusion for some, and I think the discussions in this room would support that, but I find very difficult to refute. Do we need anything to remain from the past in order to experience it? So what's the value of all these museum collections? We construct an experience of the past in the present moment. We can do that with a whole range of different vehicles. Why do we need physical things from the past in order to do that? And why do we need people inside the heritage bubble to be responsible for that? There are some fantastic projects which lie outside what we would think of as authorized heritage discourse. Clearly with artists, and this is one that I think is particularly poignant, Rosa Parks' house, and the American artist Ryan Mendoza, transporting this house piece by piece from Detroit and then setting it up as an art installation in Berlin. And all the things that I want to achieve with the conservation of heritage are achieved remarkably by this process. But this is a different process. This is outside of the authorized heritage. And there are other worlds outside the heritage world, let us not forget. Some of these, we're trying to deal with at the moment as a kind of an interface on the boundaries of this bubble. The Maker Movement and Repair Cafe, they mend stuff. They mend exactly the same stuff that we do in museums. They collate and gather stuff as well. So what's the difference between what my students do in their white coats and their blue gloves and what these people do in their pop-up repair cafes? And we started to play with this idea, the theatre of conservation, in which we perform the role of heritage practitioners, preventing people doing what they would normally do with their objects because we're in control. They're the ignorant ones. They don't know what to do. So we're having a little bit of fun with that as an idea of kind of identifying that there are these frontiers, there are these boundaries between heritage institutions and heritage professionals and practitioners. So is this inside or outside the heritage bubble? You've got volunteers who are organized by professionals, working within heritage institutions, museums, and archaeological projects. The National Trust itself is founded on volunteer help. They have over 61,000 volunteers. And most of the work effort of the National Trust goes into training and building capacity in their volunteers to support the work of the institution itself. And Henna Mihi is an example of that kind of work. And this is what I'll be doing this weekend. Anybody want to come along? More than welcome. We're doing a capacity building project at this local church in Norfolk, because these are the people who have to look after this church. There's not enough money to bring in specialists, so people do their own repairs. They do it, if they have the right materials, the right techniques, and the right skills, they can do that job very well. So we're building capacity in those people. And this is it's outside museums, is it outside heritage? There are heritage constraints that surround historic buildings. But I think for me, it's this process of guesting and hosting. And we've talked about this a little bit, about being good hosts and respectful guests. It's about who's in control of that process and how do we decenter that process significantly so that we depower the heritage professionals in that process rather than the participants. So I think participating with non-specialist heritage communities has the capacity to disrupt the authorized heritage discourse and allow us to sort of have more pointy elbows, if you like. And these are some of the things that I would make claim for, but this is what I want to produce as a result of training heritage professionals, critically engaged heritage conservators who are able to challenge the routine application of authorized heritage practices in making contemporary heritage objects and places. So I suppose this is now like a manifesto, okay? We should be doing all these kind of things. But I won't go through all of it. But I mean, the most poignant one, and this is something that I got as the only model for Maori heritage conservation of whare nui, is ask people what they want rather than assuming to know what they need. And if you can respond to that, if you can give them what they want, then that's all good. And what I would ask for is for us to give permission within this kind of authorizing process for more innovative ways of working. So we're not always prohibiting things, narrowing and constraining things, that we're giving things a broader opportunity. And this is fundamental, that we see heritage as a resource for the people that we serve rather than our resource within our professional organizations. So this includes ideas of sustainable development, human rights, diversity, equity, peace, and stability. And this sort of conforms to, it's always helpful if you're going to advocate for these things within institutions or for funding, that you link it to some big ideas. So within UNESCO, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which sees the role of heritage as something which is utilized for sustainable development, not a constraint on it. And this has led to these people-based approaches, ICROM and IUCN, and their people-centered approaches for the conservation of nature and culture, which is bringing together culture and nature together, but in the service of contemporary communities. And just finally, to sort of, if I may, just to update you on what's happening with Henna Mihi. For those of you who don't know anything about Henna Mihi was constructed in 1880 in North Island, New Zealand, in Te Warawa, just north of Rotorua. Was subject to the 1886 Mount Tarawera eruption, and as a result was then transported over to Clarendon Park near Guildford, just outside London, in the grounds of this gorgeous Palladian mansion, where Henna Mihi was set up as the meeting house down in the garden. And then we have our subsequent 20th century history at Clarendon Park, various manifestations of building in transformation, the reconnection with the source community in the 1880s, and then the adoption of Henna Mihi as a marae for the Maori diaspora, Ngāti Ranana, in London. So this converts what is an historic building into an active marae. Now the National Trust were engaged for over 10 years in a stakeholder consultation process, developing a vision for, the statement of significance for, and then a plan to change Henna Mihi and her fabric into an active marae where people can come together. And this was seen to be not just a space for Maori or people from the South Pacific, but a space to encounter cultural difference. So in a multicultural Britain, a safe space, if you like, where people can come with their cultural perspectives and then seek to understand others. So as a sort of a visionary approach, the National Trust need to be commended for that. This kind of all changed with the fire at Clarendon Park, which was a devastating event at that park. It's something that the property is still recoiling from. And that's led to a series of changes in which Henna Mihi's carvings, that's where the spirituality of Henna Mihi resides, have been removed and placed into storage. And then last October, I can't say it, it's an exchange request from the Heritage New Zealand for the return of Henna Mihi's carvings to New Zealand and the exchange of new carvings. But the repatriation word has been used. It's been used by Heritage New Zealand and it's been used by the National Trust. And that polarity has created a real sense of distrust in that relationship. The idea of building a secure, stable, long-term relationship for mutual benefit in this exchange, this long-term loan, which museums, as we hear, are capable of doing, and the exchange of things, which is a very positive process, has kind of disrupted that whole process. So we're in a period at the moment where there's a hiatus, and that's creating difficulties on both sides, within the National Trust and with the Maori community in New Zealand and in Britain, in terms of their frustrations about the process. But I just wanted to leave you with a kind of a visual image of the difference between ways of working, if you like, the ways that I see that I'm working. If we're thinking about more structured, expert-driven linear decision models as the routine in institutions, and then these more decentered, co-designed, co-produced, people-based processes, what would they look like? And this is based on some cross-section paint analysis that we did on Henna Mihi's carvings, and then a community artwork that we did at one of our capacity building events, this large painted canvas here. So we set up a painting by numbers canvas. So this is, for those of you who remember, you have a design and then you have pots of paint with numbers on them and then numbers written in the spaces. So it's quite easy. You take the paint out of the pot and you put it on the place where it's marked on the drawing. So this is our computer-generated model. This is what it should look like if everybody behaves, everything goes to plan, the speakers stay to time, and we get what we expect in this kind of closed expert system. This is what we actually got. So it's different, isn't it? It's no less beautiful, clearly, but that's the difference when you're working in this kind of decentered, you ceding control, you have to accept that the outcomes of the process are going to be different maybe from what they were expected to be at the outcomes. And that should be something that is a strength of these projects, not perceived as a weakness of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, for giving us your manifesto for disciplined conservation and a much more people-centered approach, something which I'm sure will raise a lot of discussion after this, after all of our speakers. I'd now like to introduce my colleague. He is a curator responsible for China and Korea at the National Museum of World Cultures in Sweden. Thank you,
Thank you.
Michael.
Excuse the cheesy title, I couldn't resist. So yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me today. So today I'd like to explore whether or not the idea of the ceremonial use of objects should be formally considered within the concept of collections care. A lot of the kind of topics or issues I'll talk about today was kind of addressed yesterday as well, but sometimes it positioned in a different perspective, so I hope that will also encourage discussions. So the emphasis of ethnographic museums in the West, and particularly in Europe, have broadened, and in some cases moving away from the emphasis of objects and collections towards communities. And one of the additional roles of ethnographic museums, as we know, is working with what we might call source communities, originating communities, diaspora communities, and for this talk, I'll generally just use the word communities. When we talk about collections care, we generally think about the collection as physical objects. We tend to them on a physical level, whether it's temperature, humidity, or anything that tries to prevent the physical object from accelerated deterioration. But as we now work more with topics such as including other voices within the museums, should we also, again, formally consider cultural and religious sensitivities when considering collections care? And in this presentation, other questions that could be explored include, must museum objects only be museum objects? Who is the community, and who has this type of right to access collections? So I'll first share with you two examples, and again, I work mostly with kind of East Asia, and of course, every situation has their own sensitivities, their own considerations. So I hope that other people, if they've have experienced kind of working with collections as ceremonial objects, to maybe share their experiences, and I'm hoping people can also talk about kind of if there's any situation that went wrong, because I think that's where we can learn. So these examples come from the sculpture hall that now taken off display, hopefully will come back. It's held at the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, and the sculpture hall was, the intention was to give context to the objects rather than seeing them as just sculpture, but for they were placed in a way during one of the re-displays of the sculpture hall. The idea was to group the sculptures into a culturally acceptable way rather than just saying object. And the idea was for visitors to have a better understanding of the contextualization of the objects, so that not only is there a dialogue between object and visitor, but also amongst the objects themselves. So in this first example, this is the object in question here. It's a 5th century Buddhist sculpture from Henan, China, instantly from very close to where my maternal grandmother's family from. We had a group, some nuns from the Foguangshan Monastery visit the museum and to propose an exhibition of their abbot's calligraphic works. Now, this organization is a very influential Mahayana Buddhist group throughout the world, really. For various reasons, the exhibition idea didn't pan out, but we agreed that we could cooperate on a project to help visitors get a deeper understanding for the material in the sculpture hall. So what we agreed upon was a ceremony for world peace. So this is what you see. Now, in terms of, the motivations of the different parties, from the museum's aspect, of course, it was for people to have a better understanding for the contextualization of both the objects as well as how the objects and community interact through ceremony. And I know, people might have certain ideas about this type of, in questions about the methodology, the motivations, the considerations about this type of event, which I'm very happy to discuss, but for the sake of time, I'll just say at this point that these are very much, it's very much about self-representation, as well as these are completely non-exclusive events. Anybody can come, whether or not you want to experience it on a religious level or just curious. So that was one example. Oh, right, so that was the motivations of the museum. The motivations of the Buddhist group themselves, they see this was their religious duty to perform these types of ceremonies. And the sculptures are consecrated objects, so one could also see the performance of these ceremonies is also maintaining these objects. That sculpture previously was collected around the early 20th century by Oswald Siren. So this would have been about 100 years since this object was taken out of China and decontextualized. So this ceremony in some ways is recontextualizing the object and the community as well. This is the second example. Now these are three sculptures that we talk about, for which we talk about Vajrayana Buddhism, or the Tibetan form of Buddhism. And in this case, it was a Tibetan Buddhist group that approached the museum and asked if we can host some monks from Darkroom Monastery in Ladakh in northern India, who they have a close relationship with. So we communicated with the monks, and essentially what they were hoping to do is to create butter sculptures for the deity in the middle of Avalokiteshvara. And by the way, just the background of these objects, they were collected in Chahar, Inner Mongolia, Alfi-Khakh Temple by Sven Hedin in 1926, I believe. So this was a week-long event in which the monks created the butter sculptures, or the offering to the deity. And this time the audience could come and interact with the monks, ask them questions and so forth. But I want to emphasize also, during this week, it was very much a two-way interaction. I think the visitors, by interacting with the monks, had a lot of these kind of stereotypes dispelled. Like, I think a lot of them saw that the monks were actually almost hooked on Candy Crush. But also from the monk side, Tuptenla on the left, his last day he said, I learned how to hug people in Sweden, because in Ladakh we don't hug people to greet each other. I really love hugging people. So that's, I think it really was a two-way kind of interaction. And on the final day, there was a consecration ceremony. So again, they very much see this as a religious event, but it's not an exclusive event either. You can participate in any way which you feel. And again, I would say one of the in my opinion, very important audiences for this type of event is actually the very small but coherent Tibetan diaspora community in Stockholm. They will always come to these types of events, and several times people have come to me and said, I really appreciate the organization having this type of event. And they usually say, we come here because of our children. Our children grow up in Sweden. They don't really know, what perspective? They say that the children have trouble connecting with what they see as their heritage. On more than one occasion, parents have told me, our kids, they feel nervous around monks. They don't know how to interact with monks because they don't see them on a daily basis. For instance, in northern India and Tibet and so forth, the monastic society is connected, integral with the secular society. So this is one way in which this diaspora community is able to re-engage with what they see as their heritage and museum collections. So now I'll talk a little bit more about kind of formal policies regarding the use of objects. So I tried to look for various museum policies regarding collections care to see if they formally acknowledge or consider the ceremonial use of objects by communities. And this is by no means a comprehensive study, but I just kind of did some spot checks on museums that might be interesting and that I have more closer contacts with. These museums include the British Museum, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, our lovely hosts, the Slovene Ethnographic Museum in Ljubljana, our lovely partners, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the Burke Museum in Seattle, Washington, the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. And I would say most of them, when they use the term access, generally speaking, they mean one or two things. Access in terms of scientific research access, or they mean access in terms of providing information for people, or information that could be used by people with various types of disabilities, as well as school groups and things like that, but not really in terms of the ceremonial access of objects. What I did find was in the Smithsonian Institution's Recovering Voices program, they mentioned that there is a ceremonial room at the Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, where smudging and blessings can be conducted with objects. And this room is mainly used by Native American communities. And I conducted an informal interview with Carrie Beauchamp, who's a museum specialist at MSc. And she says, even though they have this room for this purpose, nothing is formally written into their documents. It's handled on a case-by-case basis. And even in some of the other museums which I spoke with that work with this type of issue, I think most of them say, well, we handle this on a case-by-case basis, but it's not necessarily written into policy. The only document that I was able to find that specifically addresses the use of objects by communities was the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. And again, I emphasize this is not a comprehensive research. They have a document called Borrowing Conditions for Loans to Originating Communities, a Guide. It states that, and the term they use is originating communities, that they can apply to borrow objects for various reasons, including for dances. And they state that considerations for making the decisions is handled on a case-by-case basis, but that, quote, priority is given to requests which increase access for First Nations peoples and for local institutions, end quote. When speaking with collections managers and conservators within my own organization in Sweden, they say that this is a very difficult issue for their job roles, and that they've actually been speaking about this very topic very recently. On the one hand, they're charged with the long-term preservation of museum objects, and on the other hand, ethnographic museums are changing, and we need to work more closely with different communities. So our organization currently does not have anything written in policy about the use of objects, but as with the sculpture hall examples, it's handled on a case-by-case basis. So there may be good reasons why museums sometimes might be officially vague about the use of culturally significant objects by communities. There could be many problematic aspects that come up when you make these types of considerations. Of course, there's a museological concern about conservation and long-term preservation. But perhaps one of the most difficult questions is, who is the community? Who has the right to this type of access to collections? One recent repatriation case at the Museums of World Culture in Sweden is an example of how representation can sometimes become problematic and political. In 2003, we received a repatriation request of a Yaqui dance headdress from a Yaqui Cultural Foundation in Arizona in the US. On the right, you see the object as a museum object. On the left, you see the same object as a ceremonial object. So we have very good documentations about how these were collected. So again, the request came from a Yaqui Foundation in the US, in Arizona. However, the headdress and associated objects were collected in the 1930s from the Yaqui that were at that time temporarily based in Tlaxcala, Mexico, but this group was actually from the Rio Yaqui community in Sonora, Mexico, and they have since moved back to Sonora. Complicated history. Our organization have deemed these to have been collected legally by Josta Montel and Sigvald Linné. They were invited by the Yaqui community to attend this ceremony where these objects were collected via some Danish contacts. In 2017, the Rio Yaqui community in Sonora were consulted by the Museums of World Culture, and they were invited to come to the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm for discussions and to view the objects. It was very interesting because after conversations, we learned that the Sonora Yaqui were actually never consulted with by the Yaqui in Arizona about this repatriation request. And what's also very interesting is the Sonora Yaqui had very different ideas about actually which was the sensitive object. They said the deer headdress was actually not a problem. It was another mask that could potentially be a very sensitive object. Conversations also revealed struggles within the Yaqui nation regarding representation of the entire group. So issues of representation, can be, depending on the case, but potentially be filled with pitfalls and gray areas. So the ceremonial use of museum objects can help to reinforce group identity of source communities and their diaspora communities. And it can also be a way for these communities to re-engage with heritage museum collections. However, the use of objects also bring into question the role of museums and object preservation, and perhaps more provokingly, the questions of who is considered to be source or diaspora community and could potentially have this type of access to collections. As museums and organizations holding ethnographic collections become more aware of the needs and wants of communities from which their collections originate from, as well as their diaspora communities, should we also revisit what it means to care for collections? Should the awareness of cultural significance be formally stated and considered in collections care policies and guidelines? And how much weight does the cultural significance of an object have in relation to its long-term preservation within a museum context? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, our final presentation this afternoon is going to be from Judith Finlay McAllister, and she is from the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, where she works as a registrar and also manager of the Collections Access Centre. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here, and actually it's quite an honour for me to be here. I'm relatively new to the whole Switch project. I only really heard about it, I think, about a month ago when Mark contacted me and was looking for a speaker. So it's been a fantastic journey finding out about the work of Switch. It's something that I've found absolutely fascinating, and it links in very nicely not only with the work that I'm doing in the National Museum, but also with my studies as a PhD student with Trinity College. So there's been a lot of, a nice journey of discovery, finding out about it. The reason I'm here, I'd like to thank Rachel Hand from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology who put my name forward for this. You might notice when you go to events like this that the Irish voice isn't really represented that much in a public forum on an international basis. And it's something that I'll talk about quite a bit in terms of this talk, because I do think it's an interesting different slant on the care of collections. It's something that we don't really talk about, and it's something that even within the Irish context internally, we're only beginning to talk about ourselves. And what I mean by that is talk about the idea of world collections and what we hold in museums, and how we, as a country who I suppose was colonized, how we deal with the fact that we have these collections that really, in one way you could say, belong in, they sit more comfortably in the colonizing nations rather than in ours. So there is a conflict, and there has been quite a lot of conflict and internal interrogation on how we deal with that as a country and how we deal with those conflicts ourselves. But in terms of how I came to this place, I sort of came to talking about repatriation and researching repatriation in a roundabout way. It wasn't necessarily through world collections. In a way, it was through our natural history collection. And as the chair said, I manage the Collections Research Centre in Dublin. So it's basically where we've centralised all of our collections. We started it in 2010, and as part of that, we were bringing in collections from all different areas, including the world collections, and that's how I began to work quite closely with those, but also the natural history collections. So what happened in 2013 was 4 rhino heads were stolen from this centre. And it got me thinking, firstly, about what my role entails, which is risk management and trying to put better protections in place and security and all of that side of things. But it started a lot of conversations with non-museum people, and people asking me, why does the National Museum of Ireland hold something that seems to be a very big symbol of colonial times? And it's a conversation that we hadn't really had before, because the approach in the museum traditionally had been that we had these collections, they were in our stores, but we didn't really talk about them. We haven't really talked about them for the last 50 years. We've had a very nationalist focus with our collecting policies. We've had a very insular, telling the Irish story kind of approach to what we've been doing in the last 50 years. And this really opened up that conversation for the first time, really. It had been mooted around the museum, but we didn't particularly have a policy on it. We hadn't particularly talked about it. So it got me researching this side of things. And the first conversation I had on it was with a friend of mine who is a zoologist. He works in Cambodia and Vietnam, and he works on a conservation project there, protecting large areas of flora and fauna, particularly wildlife. He is actually a bat conservator himself, a bat conservation expert. And his approach was very interesting as well, because what he said to me was, why do museums hoard? And where we would have called them collecting, his attitude was, well, it's very much a hoarding mentality that comes from museums. And what he was seeing it from was, being in the natural world of conservation, he was seeing very big, very well-funded museums coming into areas in Vietnam that were protected areas, but managing to get the paperwork through somehow, and coming in and swooping through these areas, collecting massive amounts indiscriminately and bringing back enormous collections to basically build their collections. And his opinion of that as a conservator was that they were overnight wiping out various different species, and he felt it was extremely unconsidered and that it was hoarding rather than collecting. So that really made me think, okay, what are we as a museum, and what are we actually trying to do? We talk about conservation and education and being a guiding light in terms of education and the best standards to take care of collections. But this is a kind of perspective that I hadn't really thought about before, and it did make me think, what are we trying to do? Now, another part of my job is obviously around the whole world of ethics and standards, and trying to bring the ethics that are out there, and there are a lot of very well-established ethical frameworks out there that exist. And I know a lot of museums have applied these ethics very wholeheartedly to what they're doing, but the question is this idea of legacy issue. And so this really brought me back to the whole idea of repatriation, and that's where I've come in with that in terms of my research. So it's the idea that we have ethics that are going to guide us into the future, but it's this idea of how do we actually deal with the ethical issues of what we've done in the past and where we are from the past, and particularly the collections that have come into us. What I was quite excited to find out about. There's two things I'll talk about in terms of Ireland and our history in terms of repatriation. And one was, when I started looking into it, was to find out that Ireland was one of the first countries, possibly the first country, to take the British Museum to court. In 1903, the Attorney General of Ireland, whose name was actually Sir Robert Finlay, which is a nice connection for me, he brought the trustees of the British Museum to court on the basis of this particular hoard, which is called the Brighter Hoard. So it was a hoard that was found in Northern Ireland. It was held in the British Museum, and the Irish government brought the British Museum to court, and the hoard was successfully repatriated to Ireland. So it now sits in Kildare Street in our Museum of Archaeology. But I thought it was very interesting because for so long, for all the time I was in the museum, and I joined the museum in 1999, we had never had the repatriation conversation. It just wasn't talked about. And yet, back in 1903, we were actually quite ahead of the crowd, and we were the people that were bringing, formally taking cases against the British Museum. So that made me think, that's very interesting. So the next thing that I looked at, and it's actually Rachel from Cambridge here, who brought this originally to my attention, was in 1990, Ireland was one of the first to repatriate the Toimoko heads. So I think it's Stockholm, Melbourne, and Ireland. The three were those that put forward these cases for proactive repatriation and actually repatriated to the Te Papa and to the origin communities. And what was interesting again about that is that we were ahead of the crowd. It was largely driven by one individual. There was a director at the time, and he did it from a very nationalist perspective. His whole idea was that, well, we were colonized, and how could we comfortably sit with holding these collections when we know what other origin communities have gone through? So he connected with the Te Papa at the time, who had already obviously been doing some amazing work in this area. And those three heads were sent back in 1990. So what this raised for me, though, was the question of how do we have a consistent approach to repatriation? Because what happened in our example is that particular director very proactively wanted to repatriate these. He then repatriated other heads to Fiji and carried out a series of other repatriation projects. But then he retired, a new director came along, and because of the individual decision, there was no more repatriation. So what worries me most about repatriation is that it is so heavily based on the individual decision, and the individual, be it the director or the curator or the collections manager, their idea of what should and shouldn't be repatriated, and the idea that it sits with museum professionals. And believe me, as a museum professional, that's no disrespect to people within museums, but I do think it is a problem that you are so heavily dependent on the individual to make those decisions, and the individual within the museum or the museum within its own walls, within its own structure, making that decision. So part of what I've been exploring, and it's very early days, I only started my PhD this year, but something I wanted to kind of throw out to this audience is the idea of how do you create a more consistent approach. I've looked at the New Zealand example with awe. I think what has been happening in New Zealand for many, many years is astounding, and they really are a shining light in terms of repatriation. But it's very driven by their community and driven by a wisdom and a strength that comes from the Maori people. But what worries me is other smaller communities who maybe don't have that confidence, and it's something that I recognize in the Irish psyche, that in a lot of ways the Irish don't have that psyche, they don't have that confidence to necessarily put themselves forward in various different areas, and that possibly comes from that colonial hangover that people have. So I've started looking at international law to see how international law can put a stronger support system behind possibly less confident, let's say, communities who don't feel they have the strength, potentially don't necessarily have the economics or the budget to actually go forward and take on these big powers and actually bring these repatriation cases to fruition. So I'm not sure what the solution is. The various issues that I've been coming up against are the fact that international law is a guideline. It's not actually something that you have to stick with. So I think it's an interesting thing I'd love to hear if people have ideas on how we actually put that support structure in place to give more strength to the countries that are trying, or the communities that are trying to repatriate but don't feel they have the power to do so. Just as an aside, this came up just the week before, a couple of weeks before I was asked to do this. This particular case is a repatriation case that relates to an Irish skeleton. So essentially, there's a guy called Charlie Byrne, and he was known as the Irish Giant. He, throughout his life, knew that he was unusual, that he was far, far taller than everyone else. He had been the centre of attention because of his stature. And the one thing that he was terrified of was that John Hunter, who founded the Hunterian Museum, was always very interested in getting his hands on the skeleton and bringing him into the museum. So in his final will and testament, Charlie Byrne said, whatever you do, don't give me to the museum. Please bury me at sea. But sadly, there was some money exchanged with the undertaker, and the body was swapped out, was given to the Hunterian Museum, and sits in the Hunterian Museum. So this has been mooted as, you know, an Irish repatriation case. It's been on and off, and it's been talked about and debated for many years. But now the Hunterian are doing renovations and have decided that they will repatriate or meet the wishes, his final wishes, in his will and testament. So the debate around this at the moment now within our museum is what happens to Charlie Byrne? Because first and foremost, he clearly didn't want to end up in a museum. So whether he ends up in the Hunterian Museum or in the Irish Museum, it's still the same thing. And it's still disrespecting his final wish. The interesting thing is he specifically says in his will, I'd like to be buried at sea because I don't want to be taken into the museum. But what we do know about him is he was a very strong believer in the Catholic religion, and had he not had that fear of being taken by the museum, he potentially would have just wanted a normal Catholic burial. So the debate is, do we give him a normal Catholic burial in his hometown? Do we meet the wishes of his will and bury him at sea? Or do we bring him into the Irish Museum, which is technically where a repatriation case would go in this scenario? Now, I have to say the last one I think is not an option. But it's just something to think about. Maybe people have ideas on that. And it's a hot one at the moment because it's being debated, and the Hunterian are talking about returning, and this is something that we're working on. So those are just some areas from my perspective, or from the Irish perspective.
To all of our speakers who've brought very different perspectives on the question of how we care for collections, and I'm sure have raised a lot of points for discussion among the audience. Well, some of you, we've got almost half an hour for questions, and while you're, yes, and I see one here already. Here, let me go. Is this on? Yeah.
Well, thank you for 3 wonderful presentations. My question is first to Dean, all that can also be for the other ones, because you made a compelling pleading for critical conservation, which would basically put the emphasis on the contemporary uses of heritage. But now, I mean, the justification for heritage and conservation in museums has always been like at the time related to the future, something which was preserved not only for the present but for future generations. And if you privilege the present, the contemporary, what about the future of this heritage?
Glibly, I could say the future will look after itself. I wouldn't come to an archaeologist really to ask them about predictions about the future, or a heritage professional. I don't think I'm in the best position to do that. The best people to do that, surely, are contemporary communities which themselves will have an idea about how they want to see the future formed. So to go to those people, to find some kind, I don't ever expect there to be a consensus, but in order to gather a broad-based justification for making decisions around how the present does become the future. And I think there is a need to shift from this idea of salvage and scarcity into the idea of profusion and chaos that we're dealing with museum collections. We don't have a shortage of heritage objects and places. We have too many of them. And you think about the National Trust, which is the largest membership organisation, I think, in Europe. It has more members than any political party in Britain. It's the biggest private landowner in Britain. So the implications for the present are really quite concerning if we're thinking that that is a constraint on the way that the world moves from the present into the future. If we're seeing heritage as this launch pad for innovation, speculation, imagination, and creativity, I think that's a really positive thing. But if we're seeing it as a brake on, a liability, and a constraint on what we do in the future, I think that's counterproductive.
Kia ora, panelists. Fantastic. Judith, look, just one follow-up. It was in relationship to your question. Yeah. A very good question, actually. It was a question that I asked the UNESCO General Conference last year in Paris. And it seems to me that in 2015, the UNESCO, I think it was the first time in 40 years, passed a recommendation. I think it was recommendation 38, which was on the promotion and protection of museums and collections. If you have a look at that recommendation, they also include repatriation and for good museum practice to engage and consult and form relationships with Indigenous peoples and First Nations. My recommendation on behalf of the New Zealand National Commission of UNESCO was to, it seems to me, us as in a very respectful way, repatriation is a very passive process, and what it seems to me in our experience is that it's not necessarily an active activity or responsibility that museums and cultural institutions are undertaking on their own course. And our recommendation was to support that recommendation, to see whether nations that support the museums in different nations could perhaps give more, I can't quite recall the exact wording, but it was more vigor and responsiveness and to actually leadership and activity to enable the repatriation for the right reasons, in particular with ancestral remains. The other one, Dean, look, kia ora, thanks for that. I was involved in the restoration of a very large meeting house in Chicago in the Field Museum in the early 90s. And it was interesting because when I was first involved by my tribal people, I thought it was repatriation. They said, great. And I thought, yes, we're going to get it returned. And they said, Arapara, settle down. We don't want it returned. What we want to do is to restore it, restore its mana, and establish a relationship. And that relationship continues to this day. I suppose with respect to Henna Mihi, is respect in terms of the history and understanding that relationship. But look, I know that many members of the community really value that relationship that's been established over a long period of time. Kia ora.
Hi, thanks everyone for a really interesting panel. I thought one of the strengths of looking at particular case studies in a way that you've presented is that they really help us to focus down on some of those really difficult kind of problems. So I have got a long list of questions which I should limit myself just to one, but I'd like to pick up over coffee on some of the others. So I suppose I'll choose Michael as one I'll opt for. And I was struck by the examples of the ceremonies that you were illustrating there. A flower placed on a stone, sculpture, and so on. And I suppose it goes to Dean's point about the application of principles. So it's easy to apply principles when they're not compromising from a conservation or a traditional conservation point of view, the integrity of the object. But say the ceremony involves altering the object, destroying the object, whatever it might be, then do we make an exception to the principle? So that seems to me one of the real challenges, is that we can talk about principles and sign up to them, and it's that kind of switch from discourse to practice, and I think that's the real challenge for museums. So what then happens to our principles when they meet another set of principles a bit more forcefully than placing a flower on a stone sculpture?
I guess in my opinion, again, case-by-case basis, really. Within the Buddhist ceremonial context that I showed, it was very much done in conjunction also with our conservators. In the end, they did allow us to burn one stick of incense for the ceremony, so it was a bit of a compromise in that sense. In terms of altering objects or destroying objects, I personally have never had to work with this type of issue. But again, I think through dialogue, some type of compromise usually could be settled upon. Well, actually, I can give one example in our organization. I wasn't working on it, but I think maybe some of you know this, is the totem pole, the Heisler totem pole. Lotten Gustavrenius, who some of you might know, she was working on that. So that was a repatriation request from the community. The totem pole was meant to just decay in the forest. The repatriation request was accepted in the end, but in exchange we got a modern replica of the object. So the original totem pole went back and is lying down in the forest now, and the new one that was given in exchange is up in front of the Museum of Ethnography. So that's an example that our organization has worked with in terms of, I don't know, could you let's call that maybe the deterioration of object according to cultural needs. Yeah.
May I just add to that and extend the question, Michael? Has your museum ever lent objects to be used in a ceremonial context outside of the museum?
As far as I know, never. Michael, have you heard of it? No, yeah, I've never heard of that before. We have enough trouble just getting the objects out of the museum. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add something to Paul's
Yes,
question?
please do.
So I think this idea of principles, you're right, there's often a big sort of gulf between these headline principles, conventions, international conventions. But the way I think the reason why I've engaged with that process is that it enables you to have a conversation and reinterpret some of those principles and the language that's used. So, for example, the Venice Charter, which is a very kind of powerful document for conservation processes because it has a list of guidance that informs you about your decision-making. Something like minimal intervention, for example, is a very powerful way of saying, don't do anything to the object, don't touch it, keep it as it is. But if you redefine the focus of the conservation work in terms of the significance and the aspiration that object has for contemporary communities, then minimal intervention can be quite a significant intervention. So it's a question of shifting the debate, I suppose. It's owning the language or maybe reclaiming the language. So rather than that language being used as a way to prohibit certain ways of being, you can, like a wolf in sheep's clothing, you can clothe yourself in those words, the words of minimal intervention and object integrity and anastylosis, and all these concepts which tick the right boxes in terms of justifications for doing something to an object, but you can do something else as a result. So that's where I think the principles are important, and then challenging and critiquing those principles and the assumptions on which they're based. That's the essential part of then translating that into something which is a tool for decision making.
Also, very quickly, in terms of formalizing it into policy or guidelines, after kind of reviewing these different case studies that I've heard of and experienced myself, I think maybe it's difficult to be so rigid within policy, because again, I think every situation becomes such a unique concern. But I would suggest maybe at least acknowledging that there should be cultural considerations when making these decisions. I think that maybe we can at least acknowledge and explore within policies.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And you've given lots of cases that have certainly given me lots to think about. And I just wanted to pick some out as a way of, I suppose, highlighting some of the things, or I'm just interested in what you'd say. So, Judith, the Rhino Horns, you kind of, I'm left thinking, okay then, so people go and steal those. Is that a form of repatriation?
Depends on where they ended up.
I mean, they are stealing them for, we could say, cultural reasons to use in Chinese medicine. I mean, it links with what you're talking about, Michael. Where do we take that? Do we leave the doors open? I mean, I'm kind of serious. What does it mean? And I guess then it's making me think in relation to some of the things you said, Dean, which, you know, I listen, I'm really taken by it, but then I think about particular cases. So we've had recently these improvements to frescoes in Italy, quite a lot of, and as I follow that, it seems to be like usually one enthusiastic person who goes and does that. Is that the community? And I'm just wondering where we go with some of those cases.
Do we fling the doors open? Well, that wasn't the reaction. Yeah, quite the opposite, actually. It went down a very severe, heavy security risk road. But it is a good point. And actually, it's this idea of, you know, and I think you made that point earlier of what are we collecting these physical objects for? And what does it mean to have them in this collection? Can we tell that story in a different way? And, you know, like people asked me at the time, non-museum people asked a lot of questions that were very interesting of, well, would you get more rhino horns? Of course we wouldn't. And that's not in our collection policy. But then their question was, well, why have them in the first place? If you don't think that they need to be replaced, then why did you have them in the first place? You know, and it's a very interesting perspective because, you know, really at the end of the day, with all of the technology and all of the ways that we have of exploring the knowledge and everything that's around just say rhino horns as a particular object, I mean, what are we actually telling by having a physical head of a rhino in a museum? What is the story and what's the value of having it there, as opposed to having a fantastic interactive that kids can go through and find out and look at videos of rhinos and find out far more information from looking at something in a multimedia sense, in a digital sense. So, yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but it is a very interesting way of looking at it. And yeah, it does break down this idea that we have to just keep collecting and having the physical, and, you know, better to start looking at other ways of exploring the knowledge that you're trying to gain from having that physical object in the museum.
But maybe we should be celebrating theft. Maybe. I mean, I'm serious.
I mean, I can rule it out.
Would any other panel members like to respond?
So the question about the fresco example you mentioned, I think, is a really interesting one. It's not like we have a shortage of frescoes. And if you look at Herculaneum, it's, what is it? It's the worst conserved site globally. So we're not doing a very good job, you know, as professionals in that way. And I think if somebody is tasked, the example of this rural church that I'm working on, somebody is tasked with doing the necessary maintenance, monitoring and management work that sustains that thing over thousands of years. So it's not just about, you know, a single event. It's many hands, it's very small steps that transport something from the past into the present. And these things aren't time machines, you know, we're not sort of, this is one of the fictions I think that conservators are complicit within, is to sort of present an object in a timeless and placeless way, as if it is miraculously transported from a place and time to this present. And all of the hard work that needs to go into that process to change something, to adapt it, to make it something which is appropriate to the way that the museum likes things. And not a plug for the museum here in Cambridge, but it's one of my most favourite museums because it shows that whole process. The process of collecting in the field, the tobacco tins and the dino labels that go into categorization, and then the voice of the anthropologist who did that thing. So it actually gives a process by which the museum object is formed, if you like. And that's what objects are. They're processes. They're open-ended, complex processes that moved through time, and we are active agents in that process. And I think the personal responsibility you were saying about the director of the National Museum taking responsibility for repatriation, I think that's a good thing that needs to be celebrated in a way, because we're all agents of change in our institutions, and we need to take personal and political responsibility really for the work of those institutions. So it's not something that I would encourage somebody to do to a Renaissance fresco, to repaint it, but it's not something that I think is a crime or a sin. If that fresco were had legislative protection through ancient monument protection or within a museum collection, then there are kind of legislative frameworks that we have to abide by. So the fact that you can't allow people to walk off with your collections is part of the professional responsibility of heritage professionals and part of our disciplinary responsibility, I suppose. But then where we can open those things up, make them more porous, let's try and do that. So people conserving their own things is exactly what I think is the future of conservation. If there needs to be some guidance and capacity building and training, these are well-established models that can be put into place. But the fact that people have the right and have responsibility over their own heritage, I think is a fundamental principle that I wouldn't intervene with.
Yeah, indeed, a very exciting discussion. My question is for Michael, if I may. You explained to us this ritual object project, and I think it's a question for you, but also for a discussion. I think it's very interesting. Through your project, actually, you brought in additional information. What is the meaning of these objects? And I feel we as curator and collectors, the most important thing for us is actually to contextualize objects. I remember many years back, maybe 6 years ago, I was in Quai Branly in Paris, and they had this big Africa art exhibition, and you walked in, everything was dark, and then outcome this, you saw this nice objects put on high plinth and without any context, decontextualizing the objects, And I think for us it's just the opposite. We should contextualizing the objects. So I think the question is actually, how did you feed in your information you gained through this project back into the collection? Similar what I asked before.
Interesting, yeah. First I'll give you a bit of background about the sculptural. That was one of my first projects when arriving at the museum. And before, the way it was placed was kind of object. So in a sense, in a very art historical way, individual objects. And when I looked at the gallery, now it's mostly Chinese Buddhist material, mostly Buddhist in general, but some also South Asian, Jain, Hindu materials. But what I thought was the huge pink elephant in the room was the religions were never discussed. I think the way religion is seen in Sweden makes it also a little bit more sensitive, but I just felt like if we're about trying to work with communities, trying to build understandings, if you don't understand at least the basics of the kind of religions, and if which you need to understand the iconography, what more is it than just a beautiful object, So that was one of the first projects to contextualize it again through grouping in a culturally/religiously appropriate way for most of the sculptures. And actually, it was put into place. The way the gallery was designed was for it to be a very versatile place, to be able to have different types of events, including these types of ceremonial events. And again, it's not an exclusive space. The parties that are involved understand that. But in terms of how to document the meaning, the way I've been documenting is through video and kind of notes through sometimes discussions with the people carrying out the ceremonies and so forth. I was hoping that somehow the videos could be linked onto our database. Our technology, I think we're still trying to figure out how to do that. I know this was maybe about 2 years ago I asked, and at that time they said, oh, it's at this time it's not really possible, but we have much more of a technology focus now within the organization. I think the cultural sector in Sweden in general has this focus on direction for technology, so maybe this is a time to revisit connecting the video and associate documentation back to the database.
Hi, a comment for Judith and a sort of a question at the end. And I think a lot of the comments and papers we've had today have talked about the relationships between individuals and maintaining that, which has made the collections accessible over longer periods. And in Dublin, you've talked about how a lot of the World Cultures collections aren't seen as relevant, they're not connected to the Irish public. And I think a lot of the work that's going on at the moment to recontextualise those and represent them will sort of maintain that and help make them more relevant. But intriguingly, William Hobson was an Irishman from Waterford who signed the Treaty of Waitangi, and one of the men that was leading the return of the boy to Hood, his collection of Pacific objects is in the museum today. But has the museum in Ulster, have they requested the return of the boy to Hood to the north now? And I'm just wondering at that, because of the divides now, and how that is sort of materialising.
Actually, it's Donegal.
Oh. There you go, not north.
I think you'd be talking about borders and where the border lies, which is obviously a new hot topic again. But Donegal technically does sit outside the Northern Ireland border. So it's within the Republic still. So we're just about keep it, I'd say.
Two over here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your presentations. I see repatriation as a journey, and the related intellectual debate is mostly about how the journey starts. And it seems to me that we don't care so much about the destination of the objects, what happens to the objects when they leave. So when they arrive at their destinations, are they destroyed? Are they displayed? So if they are destroyed or displayed in some other contexts, so what do those endings mean to us? So because in Southern Africa, the debate is quite intense, where in the beginning of the 20th century, Rudolf Poch, for example, toured Southern Africa, digging graves and taking freshly buried bodies, boiling the bodies to take away the bones. And the debate is now about bringing these bones back to Southern Africa. So, and when they come back to Southern Africa, they are not displayed again in the museum. They are reburied, because the argument is that these are remains of human beings, and that there are spirits which move around and maybe have some implications for the living, and for that reason, they should be reburied. They should be buried like human beings, like the dead. And huge political ceremonies are organized for the reburial. So I'm asking, what do the destinations or the ending of the journeys of these objects means for us? Thank you.
I would say if you accept the repatriation request, you give up control. It's the community to decide, in my opinion.
I suppose key difference between something like a long-term loan, which is a euphemism often for repatriation, but it maintains control of the host institution on the destination of that material.
Certainly, in terms of human remains, most communities that are taking human remains back are taking them back for that reason, to either rebury or deal with in the cultural context of their community. So you very rarely find that, not any case I know, that human remains would go to another museum and then be displayed in that sense, because that's kind of considered the violation to begin with. So, and even within Ireland, we have a lot of reburials on religious grounds where archaeological excavations would have happened, and then the community from that particular area will ask for reburial, and we do a lot of reburial in that sense, even within an Irish context. So I think that would be the standard.
I'm no expert on yaki, but from what I understand from this situation, there's been different removals of yaki populations, and actually the yaki population in Arizona has been removed to Arizona back in the day. Same thing when it was collected, the Tlaxcala community, they were actually originally a slave community that were brought from the Sonora community. And then later it was replaced by a soldier Yaqui population, and again, they have since gone back to Sonora today. So I guess in this case, genealogy could be a bit difficult because we don't know which populations went where, which communities were split up. I guess from this point of view, we knew that the Arizona Yaqui no longer practice these ceremonies, and perhaps, I don't want to misrepresent them, but perhaps that is why there was this kind of, they were saying the deer headdress was more significant, whereas the Sonora Yaqui were saying the deer headdress is no problem, it's another piece that was significant. So, I mean, if it were more of so in this case, I guess we deferred to the community that still carry out these ceremonies. But absolutely, I would say, sorry, yeah. Yeah, but otherwise, absolutely, genealogy, I would say, if you have the genealogy, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and that broader sense, you know, every single living Māori person has the right to go and look at the collections held in the British Museum, for example, because they have genealogical ties to it, regardless whether we have a unified voice or not, you know, we have the right to be disorganized. You know,
Absolutely.
Horrendous reasons why we are.
Absolutely. And absolutely, you know,
undergone these massive changes. But the fact cannot be denied that they are genealogically tied to all those ancestors, regardless of the upheavals or those important geographical, historical, and technical considerations that we've just mentioned. That still can't be taken from them, no? They are the descendants.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Arizona Yaqui, they also no, actually they were invited to come. They decided not to come in the end. But yeah, absolutely genealogy. If there's a genealogy there, absolutely. But you know, communities in general, we don't say no to people who request to come see the object. It's more of a question of if a community is coming to request repatriation. We just have to do due diligence to see, is this necessarily the most, is this group of people the ones that represent the community from which the object has that voice for the object? Again, a lot of gray areas and sometimes by degrees, but absolutely, yeah.
Then was
Not a day older.
Vanity prevails. It's interesting that you bring up those examples and you speak about this idea of minimal intervention when I can draw on an example working with Henry over here on the I wouldn't even call it a restoration project, it was beyond that. It was going to the National Museum of Scotland and seeing a pile of broken bits of waka that was beyond the capabilities of the conservation or anybody in fact. And a big part of me and others was that the best thing we could do was just pour petrol on it and put a match to it. Because it was in that state of disrepair. And you could say the same about the Pahaki in Portsmouth, that they were at that stage, right? And so it requires actually maximum intervention on both of these examples where for the first thing I did, for example, with the project with the waka was to insist on a naming ceremony so that we could shift from calling it a thing and talking in front of it, which is really bad manners, by the way, to talk about somebody in front of somebody without introducing yourself. It's very bad manners. And to treat like a person, first and foremost, and that paved the way for the project, in my view, to succeed. And from a conservation point of view, I don't think that I'd get away with those things again in another institution. And what we did with that waka, where we transformed her into, from a broken pile of thing that nobody could deal with, into the centerpiece of the new hall. And I think the same goes with the Pahaki in that you must argue that Jim was equally as much a conservation person as you are. And in fact, even to some extent more, because I maintain that the museums are charged with the custodianship and the protection of the physicality of these tonga. And the metaphysical aspects that surround these tonga are not the preserve of the museum. That's persons like my job. And we should be very clear about these roles, and we should do our job well and not try and do each other's job. Like, I don't think the museum should try and do George's job. The museum should do the museum's job well, and I'll endeavour to do my job well, and we are in an effective partnership. And it was interesting to see the work of Jim Schuster, because he does bridge the two gaps, he does the two. You know, and they inform each other, I suppose, both the physical and the meta. So, but yeah, I would definitely say that with minimal intervention, because it was quite amazing to see what's happening with the West project for Pahaki, for example.
Well, I would hope 10 years on that way of working, George, is more accepted and more appropriate than maybe it was when you were doing the Waka project. Because certainly, I now would have a language to argue for that approach. And the way that the single project comes out of that production process, the making of the museum object, it's a process, and the process has to be justified, because you can't justify the singular product, so what the Puhaki was like, what the waka was like, because other people will have different opinions. I think you and Jim had different opinions about the gourd and about what it meant. And that's one of the challenges, I think, when you're dealing with physically intervening with an object and changing it, removing things from it, adding things to it. You have to be confident that in that change, that you're gaining more than you lose. So it's the justification of the process through which you go from. And I agree, there are specialists. Rosanna Raymond described her role as spiritual conservation. So her role would be to do exactly what you were describing. But to facilitate that, to have a process which is porous enough to enable that to take place, that's, I suppose, our responsibility.
Well, thank you very much. There are more questions, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut the sessions there. It's very interesting, I think, that the discussion about how we care for collections has inevitably brought us to questions of ownership, repatriation, objects as living beings, and the spiritual as well as the physical care for objects, things which will be picked up, I'm sure, in tomorrow's discussion in the panel. So thank you very much, and I would particularly like to thank Dean, Michael, and Judith for a great session. Thank you.